fact the path they're on is in this green domain, where in fact the world is moving very quickly to these much more sophisticated models, and larger organisations tend to move up this path slower because they have the DNA of the technologies of yesterday rather than the technologies of today. An interesting challenge. Now, this picture was a massively complicated set of information, which I thought, well, the hell with that, let's just tell you what the facts were. Social economic benefits measured, derived from broadband in Europe over the last few years. Right across Europe, 105,000 jobs created, built upon the digital economy every year and growing. 82 odd billion euros per year of additional revenues flowing, and a significant, close to 1% of GDP growth right across Europe. They are very, very significant impacts, and yet they are being measured in a way that is not really a digital economy way. So there's a long way to go before the real impacts of that are understood. So we have a bigger universe emerging for our service models. We have digitisation of everything. Pretty much everything is digital. In fact, I was looking recently, I think it takes a couple of terabits of bits per second of information to completely saturate a human's sensory organs. So there is, I guess, a practical limit to how much data we could ever have. But what I thought was interesting was now, every year on the planet, we tend to generate almost the same amount of digital information as existed the entire previous rest of Earth's history. So think about what that means. So, this year it's going to be double what it was for the entire history before. Next year it'll be double that, and so on. That is extraordinary, and comments made this morning about how things have to change to accommodate that world. Not a truer word could be said. That is absolutely fundamental. So the crowdsourcing and the wisdom of crowds is a very fundamental piece of this. I mean, there are already lots and lots of great examples of new business models emerging through crowdsourcing models. People now are making a living bidding for work online, regardless of where they happen to live, and doing things in new ways. I think time's going to kill me, so I've got to be a bit careful not to dwell here too long, but there are really important new areas of science now emerging around how to build trust models, how to build security, how to deal with privacy protocols, and how to handle the standards required for that. Australia is forging ahead on many fronts, not least of which is thinking about and doing work in the areas of trust and security. Think about the importance of your identity when your electronic identity is the one thing that will determine the validity of your education or your work experience or your financial state or your health. All of these things need to be incredibly secure and appropriately protected. That doesn't mean that when you're playing an online computer game, your status in that environment needs to be secured and locked down like it's a secret inside the Pentagon. But it might be quite important and valuable to you, so it needs to be at least secure enough to be protected in that context. But that same identity that you'll have in that context will be used right across your entire life. Some things will be incredibly private and incredibly secure. Other things will be moderately secure and appropriately secure. But the whole science of working through that I think is fascinating, because one can ask the question then, well, who do you trust to administer that? And does it need to be geographically relevant? I don't think it does, and I'm not sure there's a candidate to be the trusted keeper of such a thing. So those things are where the challenges lie. I won't really spend a lot of time on this. I did want to bring out one or two things though, and the conversations we've had this morning about the NBN were all sufficient to really cover off many of the issues, but I did want to bring out a couple of just quick key things, and this is just my way of seeing the internet. We talked about the 121 points of interconnect. It's very important to understand that the NBN's role starts in homes at the bottom and buildings of any kind, and stops at the point of interconnect. other players join those points of interconnect together, and other players still offer services over that infrastructure. And those 121 points of interconnect are very important places. In fact, over the digital economy evolution over the next little while, those physical locations, I think, are going to get more and more important. You know, there is one of those, as we heard this morning, in Dubbo, and it serves a pretty broad region. It extends, you know, right through to Burke and extends to, you know, a pretty substantial part of the state. The reason it does is because every single one of those points of interconnect serve roughly 80,000 or 90,000 premises. And it doesn't really matter whether those premises are in a city or in a rural community. One point of interconnect serves about that many. So of course, if you go to somewhere like Sydney or Melbourne, there are a number of them in the city because each one is serving about 80,000 premises. The one here, of course, serving 80,000 premises, has to cover a bigger territory to collect that many premises. But what that brings is an opportunity to deliver services just into that community and service that market of 80,000 premises in a relatively unique way if there's an interest to do so. I think that's a very, very interesting outcome of the architecture. So I think we'll see at that point of interconnect layer a really interesting emerging environment for data hosting and sharing and cloud service hosting particularly, for everything, for government services, for entertainment, for local community things, for national things, for international things. I would foresee a world where the economics of delivering content over networks will be such that the critical locations for that content will be sourced from networks, stored relatively locally, and those points of interconnect around Australia will become the premium locations for information storage. And so if you happen to be a service provider living in this town near a point of interconnect, then you can gradually, once the NBN is built, deliver services to all 80,000 of the dwellings within that point of interconnect without having any of the cost associated with connecting to all of the other 120 of them across the country, if you don't want to. Or you might choose to deliver services just to 2 or 3 points of interconnect and only deal with the cost of connecting 2 or 3 together. There are many different regionally based sorts of business models that may well emerge in this environment. So let me just use this simple example of a model. Because one of the interesting things that happens when you look at any point of interconnect location in Australia, it generally comes with a regional major hospital. It generally comes with, that hospital comes with dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands, of associated little businesses that sit around that hospital for providing analysis, all sorts of specialists, all sorts of surgeons, all sorts of recovery, treatment processes, you know, all of the things that go to make up the whole health infrastructure tend to gravitate around a single major hospital. And the people, of course, who go to that hospital more often than not also live geographically within the same regional footprint. So if we just take, and I know this is a slightly oversimplified model, but just take the assumption that one point of interconnect, one wonderful big regional hospital, a whole bunch of associated small industries, and a whole bunch of consumers who are in fact potential patients. They all live potentially under one point of interconnect. That community, from a health service perspective, may need very little connectivity to the outside world beyond those 80,000 homes and those hospitals and those small businesses. It would be entirely possible to see a business model emerge where that hospital delivered services when needed to any or all of the homes within that footprint, just purely for the delivery of health services. And that could happen with or without the internet, because the NBN can support services that aren't on the internet as well as services that are. And it can support them at the same time. So that's a really, really interesting, potentially new and exciting business model. And just to make this point a little further, colours didn't really work too well here. Each of these towns has a big circle around it, covering the people who live within that footprint of that town broader, you know, out onto the farms, out onto the properties. Let's say that town A is where we are here, and that's where the point of interconnect is. Towns like Mudgee and Burke and others are other towns on this diagram. Now, if you're a service provider sitting in Dubbo and you want to deliver services to this entire community, you can, by simply connecting to one place. at that point of interconnect. There might be internet services, they may not. The tricky thing is, if you happen to live over here in town F, if you want to connect to the 80,000 people who are connected to your local NBN point of interconnect, that happens to be back in Dubbo. You've got to find a way of getting a connection back to that point in Dubbo so you can service the people in your own town. And what comes for free then is access to all of those other towns in that footprint. So there are potentially interesting business dynamics that emerge from this. There are potential winners, there are potential losers, and I don't mean catastrophic winning and losing. There are services here with higher costs, there are services with lower costs. And we could talk about that all day. And just to make this point, and I did steal this chart from NBN, it showed all three access technologies of fibre, wireless and satellite. All I tried to do on top of this is illustrate that that hospital service may be delivered to a device in the home completely independently of a connection to the internet. So whether you're connected on any one of those three technologies, doesn't really matter which one, it's practical and easy to deliver multiple services. And the service everybody's talking about in the political domain and in the media is connecting you to the internet. But in fact, the network is a multi-service network delivery infrastructure which can deliver you up to 4 completely separate services. And they don't all have to be internet-based services. They could be other things. In fact, I've been talking to at least one state government in Australia about the possibility of the state government providing at its cost a connection to every home within the state so that it can deliver state-based services potentially in a digital economy way at a lower cost than would have been done without the underlying infrastructure. I think that has some really interesting, profound implications for government service delivery generally, things like Centrelink and federal services, as well as state, like education and health-related services, and so on. Even local councils are very, very interested in the idea of community services being delivered to the community. And it just happens that if you're in a community that's within a point of interconnect, the other people within that region will be able to see what's going on in that council too, because they happen to live within that same service delivery area. And then it's a matter of how they want to sell those services. So, at a local government level, and in fact, Tim Williams did a lot of work in switching on Coffs Harbour as a critical piece of work supporting local government. I've also been quite involved in that region as well for other and related projects. There's a whole lot of things that local governments are doing, and this example from Coffs Harbour is just one. There are a whole range of potentially new and interesting digital services, but there's also a real role of advocacy within local government. There's that whole entrepreneurial, and I didn't spell that, Tim did, I couldn't, entrepreneurial capability there, as well as building local industry through internet service providers and potentially retail service providers of other kinds of services. A convener of workshops with local small business, all sorts of different things, opening for digital inclusion, opening for EU democracy or any of the other buzzwords. Let's miss that, I think we haven't got time. And that as well, I think. But high-speed broadband for places is really about what you might call democratising the economy. The idea of being able to be just as included wherever you are, and whether it's a permanent wherever you are or whether it's a temporary wherever you are, it doesn't matter. The fact is, when you are able to be connected